During its lifetime in the 20th century, the Soviet Union ruled as one of the most powerful countries in the world, feared by Western civilization because of its military might. Most notably its nuclear arsenal, the USSR seemed like an impenetrable force that would lead the world to a total catastrophe. Despite years of turmoil between the superpower and the United States, the ticking time bomb of the Soviet Union was defused internally between 1990 and Christmas 1991. A peaceful Passover compared to expected outcomes was extremely unpredicted, and I plan to investigate the final days of the Soviet Union to determine how it all unfolded.
To collect further insight on my question about the fall of the Soviet Union, I have contacted Tom Shea to answer a few questions for me. First off, throughout your life, how concerned are you about the looming threat of total nuclear war from the Soviet Union?
Well, I think as a kid, I knew that the Soviet Union had weapons and we had weapons, but it wasn't something that loomed heavily on my mind. I mean, I had a pretty peaceful, happy childhood and didn't really worry about it too much growing up.
Overall, what was your perception of the USSR?
I think I mean, whenever the Olympics came around, it was always, sort of an us against them, you know, um, theoretical battle, but I didn't think about him much on a regular basis. I did have my neighbor Darren Phil's father had immigrated from Russia many years before, and he made a trip back. And while there, he had his camera confiscated. This was probably in the early '70s because he had taken a picture of a gas station. So I remember that was the story I remembered as a kid because it was just unusual to have a tourist's camera taken away by the police because he took a picture of a gas station. Um, but that's that's about it.
So the Soviet Union officially dissolved during Christmas of 1991. Do you remember what you were doing around that year?
1991, I would have been just 29 years old, and it was a year before I met your mother. So my life was just about to change, and I was just about to change jobs. So it was a lot going on. I don't remember specifically the right around when the Soviet Union collapsed. I do remember when the Berlin Wall came down, and I remember prior to that all of the um, strikes and protests in Poland under Lech Walesa. But I remember that more clearly than the actual fall of the Soviet Union.
So you said that you don't remember exactly the fall of the Soviet Union. Do you know what led up to the fall?
I think when Ronald Reagan became president, he had put so much money into the arms race that we just sort of drove them into bankruptcy in the simplest terms. They just couldn't keep up with the with paying for all the munitions based on their communist economy versus our capitalist economy. Um,
Mm-hmm. So besides for the Star Wars initiative, um, and interiorly inside the Soviet Union, what caused it to collapse in the year prior to the actual event was not only were countries wanting to be free of the grasp of the USSR, but also Gorbachev was being pulled by the old fashioned Communist Party along with Boris Yeltsin owned more democratic party. And after a coup that was in action to possibly take out Gorbachev, which failed, Gorbachev resigned from the Communist Party, and then once the Soviet Union completely collapsed, he resigned from Russia, and Yeltsin took his place as president. On the topic of Yeltsin, how did you feel about him as a leader, from what you know?
well, I do remember still, there was still a sense of excitement that they weren't necessarily our enemies anymore. Um, but I also remember that he had a reputation for drinking and dancing like a bear and things. He seemed kind of comical, but it certainly was. It seemed like a more peaceful time under him than under Brezhnev or any of the other previous leaders.
So during the time of the collapse, how did you feel about it?
I think I felt, I would say I felt hopeful for humanity. Not necessarily like, like America had won, but
And
the planet won.
was it like a surprise for you? Did you ever think that could have been the outcome?
No, I don't think I ever really did think that it would ever happen. It was a happy surprise. I'm not sure now that things are as good as I would have hoped it would have been then, but it's certainly better than the old Soviet days.
Did you ever think any other communist countries could have faced a similar fate following the end of the USSR?
I don't know. I think they're all slowly shifting a little bit more towards some form of democracy, but there's still plenty of communist regimes out there that they're not
Okay.
democratic.
And lastly, do you think Russia today has improved since its separation from the rest of the Soviet Union, or do you think it's around the same or worse or what?
Well, I think there's probably less hope today than when the Soviet Union first fell. I think that in Russia at least that is. I think in Germany things are better, in Poland things are better, but in Russia itself, I would say things are still a mess. Their economy's in shambles, and the ruble's about worth about half of what it was a couple of years ago.
In conclusion, the collapse seemed to be less relevant at the time than I expected. Due to the Gulf War being around the same time as the breakup, the event could have easily been overlooked. Overall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, along with the termination of the USSR, brought a more friendly climate between Russia and the US, which continued into Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin's presidencies.